investment theory as nowadays presented in textbooks is a sham, is a shame, is a disaster. There is no convincing, robust, acceptable presentation of investment as a function of rate of interest. The basic problem is that the original conception, neoclassical conception, doesn't have investment as a separate entity, it has a demand for capital. And one can derive investment from it as the gross investment implied by the demand for capital. Garignani has explained this in his paper, Notes on Consumption, Investment and Effective Demand. So what one has is, as rate of interest changes, assuming the full employment of labor, one can understand what is the total amount of capital conceived in the traditional neoclassical way that would be implied by equilibrium of the labor market and then the rate of interest. And then one can understand if that is the capital demanded, that means the need to reconstruct, to replace the part of this capital which gets periodically destroyed. And so there is a gross investment implicit in it. And from this one can go to net investment if one understands, as admitted in fact by traditional classical authors, that when the rate of interest changes, one can only change the capital-labor proportion realistically in new plants, because old plants by now are there, and they will earn residual quasi-rents, and therefore it's only on new plants that one can change the capital goods, the form of capital, and measure the marginal product of capital and reach the new capital-labor ratio, and therefore the rate of interest will be determined in fact by the capital-labor ratio on new plants, the supply of savings, and the full employment of labor, which determines how much labor gets gradually freed by the closure of the oldest plants. Okay? Now, this is the basic idea, okay? But this needs the full employment of labor. With Keynes, correctly, this assumption is questioned. How can we assume full employment of labor? Full employment must, if at all, come out of analysis, not be assumed to start from. But in Keynes, the implications of this fact are not well discussed. Keynes attributes the decreasing shape of the marginal efficiency of capital to a short period reason that he himself admits to be transitory only, and therefore insufficient for a theory like his theory, which wants to argue that an unemployment can be persistent, and to a long period theory, which is that when one increases the amount of a capital good, what the capital good will earn will decrease, which is illegitimate, because since he has unemployment, one can increase the amount of all capital goods and increase employment at the same time, and then, as again Garignani had noticed in one of his footnotes in that paper, there is no reason why the marginal product of capital goods should decrease. And this big hole in the theory of investment remains all during the discussions on the neoclassical synthesis and afterwards. And so one finds that there are attempts at justifying this decreasing investment schedule, which are all theoretically unacceptable. And I distinguish three. One is, like in Farmer, Werner, Biblos, and go just a little more caution, Mankey. One starts from a decreasing marginal product curve of capital. One draws it as decreasing, and then one says, this shows if the rate of interest goes down, then firms want more capital, and therefore they will invest to reach a greater amount of capital. Now, this is illegitimate, because this investment function, which is thus derived, is then used in the ISLM scheme, where the full employment of labor is not assumed. But to derive a decrease in marginal product of capital curve, you must have a given amount of labor. So this is illegitimate. Then other people Martin Asinetti, and more recently Krugman, Blanchard. Blanchard is less clear, but if you read it carefully, this is what he says. Assume a given series of possible investment projects considered by investors, and each one has a given rate of return, that is, a given maximum rate of interest one could afford to pay without going into losses. And then, as the rate of interest goes down, more projects become convenient. Okay? And now that has been totally destroyed already, independently of Garignani and other people like that, by Ackley, Gardner Ackley. Gardner Ackley was the author of the biggest, most used macroeconomic text in the 60s. Then he became assistant and consultant to the Kennedy government, was in government for many years. In the 1970s, he comes back to University of Michigan, and he rewrites his textbook. And I think it's an excellent textbook, neoclassical, but absolutely excellent. And there he shows very clearly this way of approaching investment problem is totally illegitimate, because how can you keep the returns from investment projects as given when you change the rate of interest? The rate of interest is a cost. Therefore, it enters prices. Therefore, prices will change. Therefore, the whole series of investment projects will all, their rate of return will all move together with the interest rate. Besides, any difference in investment projects can only be temporary, because investment will go to the investment which give a higher rate of return. So this sort of step function that one can build according to Martin, Asinetti, etc., will not only move together with interest rate, but will also all the time tend to become flat, and only novelties will change it. So I think it's totally indefensible. And then there is a series of approaches, more recent approaches, among which I will discuss in this paper adjustment costs. And I take the example of Romer to show that even advanced macro textbooks are no better than intermediate macro textbooks. And Romer is only better than people before him, like, for example, Treadway, Gold, and etc., on adjustment costs, because he does not take as given the price at which the firm will sell the product. Do you understand what that means? Given price when one then changes the rate of interest? I mean, this is totally nonsense. Anyway, what Romer does, instead of taking a given price, he takes a little more flexible thing, a given industry demand curve. But that's the same thing. I mean, the moment you change rate of interest, demand curves are going to move about, because there will be influences on prices of things, and therefore things demanded by consumers will change. Also, imagine what sense does it make to consider, for example, an industry producing capital goods. The rate of interest changes, firms change their preferred methods of production, so they demand different capital goods. What's going to happen to the demand curve of the industry which was producing the capital goods first demanded, or demanded afterwards? So all this is really heavy, dangerous miseducation of people. I mean, students get accustomed not to think about these things. That when you change the price of a factor, you are going to change the price of products. That you have to take into account all the interrelations. This, of course, older economists did take into account. And nowadays we have people who, on the contrary, think that it's legitimate to go on along these disastrous paths opened up by people because they got their articles published